Everybody, this is Dream, and today we have a 10-game NFL slate for you. Before I get started, can you guys smash that like and subscribe button? It really does help the channel. I'll give you my bets here in just a second. Make sure to check out the Discord and other things in the links below. You can also check out the thing to go to the DraftKings Sportsbooks and join up there. Make sure to check all those things out. And check out YouTube memberships too. I will be making more videos as we go now that we have a lot of different sports playing, so stay tuned. So let's go ahead and get into the slate here. So let's go ahead and do the bets here first. So my top bets here are going to be Detroit with the money line over Carolina. I do like Indianapolis +2 over Tennessee. I do like Miami -12 over the New York Giants. I do like Baltimore. Let's find them here. Baltimore -4.5 over Pittsburgh. I do like Philadelphia -4 over the Rams, and then I also like Kansas City -3.5 against Minnesota. So those are my bets picks. You can find those on Sportsbook. Let's go ahead and get into the slate though for our plays. So we're gonna start with our quarterbacks. So we're gonna start with Patrick Mahomes. He's in a very plus defensive matchup here in a game that should score a ton of points. He's obviously a great option on this slate, though he is fairly expensive at $8,200. He's been very good so far, and he has really good upside for this game. He didn't do quite as good against the Jets, but I think the defense here is going to be a bit weaker for Minnesota, so I expect him to have a huge game. We'll also look at Jalen Hurts for Philly. Now, the Rams are tough against quarterbacks, but he's been solid so far this season, and he's somewhat matchup proof with his running fantasy point boost as well. So he definitely has a lot of upside in this game, though he is only $200 cheaper than Mahomes. If you can afford Mahomes, obviously, that's going to be probably the way to go. For a cheaper option, Tua is going to be a great option. He's quite a bit cheaper, almost $1,100 cheaper than Mahomes. But he does have some nice upside versus a team that really hasn't been good much this season. He has a lot of utility here. The Giants have been pretty much bad across the board in every way. So as long as they continue to stay bad, then he's going to have some tremendous opportunity to have a big game. Lamar Jackson is interesting today against Pittsburgh. He's got a very good plus matchup here, which gives him a lot of upside. That said, he's a bit more expensive than I'd like him to be. Considering Mahomes is only $300 or $400 more expensive, if you can afford Mahomes, obviously that's going to be the way to go this game. And then obviously Kirk Cousins from Minnesota. Now he does face Kansas City. I still expect this game to be high scoring. I think both teams are going to score over 25, maybe 30 points. So he's definitely going to have some capability here. He had a big game against Philly, so I'm not too, and against the Chargers, so I'm not too worried about him not doing great here. He should have a solid game, though there are some interception risks there, but he's a little bit cheaper than the other options, so he's a viable option on this team. Then we'll look at the running backs here. We'll start with Bijan Robinson. He has been pretty solid so far. He's had 3 of the 4 weeks over, even with no rushing touchdowns. He's managed to have really good output. He's had 320 fantasy point games, and he faces an average at best run defense here. I do think this is a good opportunity for him against Houston to have a big game and hopefully finally get that touchdown. Then we're going to look at Joe Mixon for Cincinnati. Now, he's pretty cheap because he hasn't really done a ton this season. Cincinnati does have to figure out how to play, I guess, but they've lost 3 games, and 2 of them they scored a total of 3 points. That said, Mixon has had a touchdown in one of the other games, and it might be giving him some more touches now to help. It'd be nice and cheap here. If he can score a touchdown, he'll definitely pay off. He's been pretty good in the past, so I expect him to have some utility here, and hopefully Cincinnati can figure out how to win a game again. Then we'll look at Derrick Henry for Tennessee. He's run all over Cincinnati, and now he gets to run all over Indianapolis. He's in a really good matchup here with a lot of upside. Obviously, it's very expensive, but he's pretty close to matchup proof. He didn't do great against Cleveland, but they got behind early. I expect that won't be the case this time, so I expect him to have a big, solid game here. Alvin Kamara has been back for 1 game so far, and in that first game he scored 21 fantasy points. He's a little bit underpriced. I don't necessarily expect him to get a touchdown or 2, but I do think he's have some viability here. I don't think he'll get the targets he got in the last game through the air, but he's definitely going to get a couple, and so he has some nice upside in this matchup, and he got 11 rushing attempts, and I expect his role to increase as he goes as well. So then we'll look at David Montgomery for Detroit. He's had a rough start to the season fantasy point wise, but he had a big game versus Green Bay, and he scored 5 rushing touchdowns already. His price is cheap, and he has upside. He has a very nice plus matchup here. Carolina has not been very good against the rush so far this season, so I expect him to have some utility. Then Akane for Miami. He's kind of a He's been extremely good the last 2 games. Somewhat of a cheat code for them. He didn't play the first game of the year, but and then against Denver when they scored 70 points, he had a breakout game with a whole bunch of touchdowns. He had 2 more last week against Buffalo. He's got a better matchup this week, and he has some nice utility. I think they're going to go to him early and often and try to get him in the game, be involved. And so he's a great option on the slate as a value play. James Conner for Arizona, also a good play here. In 4 games, he's had over 19 fantasy points, and Cincinnati hasn't been able to stop anyone on the ground. So I do like his utility though, but he's high risk, high reward. He's kind of a boomer bust option. And then DeAndre Swift also kind of fits into that boomer bust option at $6,000. He's a pretty good price, so he's got a tough matchup against a tough team, but he is capable in some games, especially as kind of a contrarian way for Philly to play, as obviously they tend to pass the ball a lot, and Jalen also has the ability to run. So I do think Swift is kind of a contrarian option sometimes. He doesn't always get a lot of touches, but I think today he might get some, so I think he's a good option on the slate. Maybe the wide receivers here, we'll look at Tyreek Hill and Jamar Chase. Now, Tyreek Hill is very pricey, and he's a boomer bust option. He's capable of monster games, but his targets have been inconsistent so far this season. That said, he's got big time upside. He can score 30 or 40 fantasy points on a dime, so he's definitely in play here. Jamar Chase has been very inconsistent so far this season, and the 1 game that he got targeted a bunch, he scored 30 fantasy points, and the other 3 he's been right around 10. Obviously, we need him to have a lot more than 10 to pay off here, but I think if Cincinnati decides to throw him the ball more, then he's definitely going to have a huge upside here. A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith are both in play for Philly. Now, I think one of these 2 guys are going to have huge games. Trying to figure out which one, though, is probably going to be harder to do. I'm leaning towards A.J. Brown, but they both have tough matchups, and so I think A.J. Brown's probably a little bit safer, but he's also a little bit more expensive. Then we'll look at Nuka for the Rams. Now, teams have really done good against Philly through the air, and I look for him to have an opportunity to have a big game here. Though I do think that this game could be inconsistent, but it should be a good scoring game. And he's been kind of a big boost to fantasy the last couple of weeks, though he's come up in price quite a bit. So he's going to be a little bit harder to roster, but he's definitely viable on the slate. Then we'll look at Garrett Wilson here for the Jets. Now, he's been one of the few guys on the Jets that really played well. His price has actually dropped too, but he's been over 10 fantasy points in all 4 games, and it gives some upside here in a plus matchup, so I think he's a viable option. Michael Pittman also in play for Indianapolis. He's been pretty solid so far this season. He's gotten a lot of targets in the first 3 games. He didn't have as many against the Rams, but he gets back to a nice plus matchup against Tennessee, which should give him a lot of utility here, and he's nice and cheap, which definitely helps. Then we'll look at Marquise Brown for Arizona. Now, he's in a pretty interesting situation as his targets have been pretty solid, and he's been getting some good catches. And he still hasn't gotten over 100 yards, but he got pretty close last game against San Francisco. He's got a plus matchup here, and he's been over 15 fantasy points in the last 3 games. And so he's a very safe option while being very cheap as well. And then DeAndre Hopkins at $5,700. Now, he's been inconsistent this season, and it doesn't seem like he's really fared well so far. He's still getting some targets, but he really hasn't done a lot. But he's capable of big touchdowns and stuff like that. If Tannehill can get on the ball, which is probably the problem here, is that Tannehill is not great at getting a guy, this kind of player a ball. So maybe they switch to other quarterbacks or something. But he's definitely in play. He's just high risk, high reward today. Looking at our tight ends, obviously Travis Kelce, he's been pretty solid so far this season after he came back from injury. Notwithstanding the crazy amount of stuff that's going on around him, he still managed to score decent fantasy points, though he does need to score a touchdown really to pay off, and so that is the concern here. But he's definitely viable on the slate. TJ Hawkinson is also in the same game. I actually think he's got some more upside than Kelce does in this particular game, because I think Minnesota will have to go to him more to keep this game close, and hopefully he can score a touchdown in the process. The next guy I would look at is Mark Andrews. He's obviously been pretty solid for Baltimore when he gets a lot of targets, and he managed to get pretty decent yards and touchdowns and stuff like that. I think they're going to go to him a lot in this game as Pittsburgh, while their defense is pretty weak. He's going to have a lot of opportunity to have a solid game here. Then we'll get some cheaper options in Laporta for Detroit. Now, he's been pretty good so far this season, surprisingly. He's getting more targets than I expected, but Detroit's playing pretty well, so I think he's a viable option here. I can't believe that Detroit's 3-1 at the moment, so but he's been one of the reasons he's played pretty solid, so I like his upside, and he has touchdown potential. And then two value plays, extreme value plays, is Dallas Goedert for Philly. They're going to need him to have a big game here to pay off and for them to get the win. He's not been great so far this season. He's getting a lot of targets. He's not getting a ton of yards and doesn't have a touchdown yet, but I think that might change today. And then a very cheap option, Zach Ertz for Arizona against Cincinnati. He's actually gotten quite a few targets so far this season. He still hasn't scored a touchdown, but he doesn't need a ton of fantasy points to pay off at this price point, and he's definitely capable of getting over 10 in this game. So then we'll look at our defenses here, and we'll start with the Miami Dolphins. Now, Dolphins have a great matchup against the Giants. They've been absolutely terrible this season so far. I expect the Dolphins to handle them and hopefully get a couple of sacks as well, maybe an interception or two, which seems like that's very likely today. And so I do think they have I think they can score over 10 fantasy points in this one, though they're not the best defense on the slate. They definitely have some capability. The Detroit Lions have gotten a lot of interceptions so far this season and a lot of sacks, and that should give them some upside here. They've had two games over 10 fantasy points, and the third one over 9, including that game against Kansas City. So I expect them to have a really solid game today. They're a little bit more expensive than Dolphins, but they're definitely capable of having a big game here. And then a couple of cheaper options, or sorry, not a cheaper option, the Ravens. They are facing Pittsburgh. Now, they've had 4 interceptions on the season. They haven't got as many sacks as they normally get, but they're definitely capable of it. And they've had some pretty good games so far, and this is a great matchup for them to have a really solid upside. And then the Saints, they're my value play for the defenses. They're placing New England, who really hasn't done all that much yet. They managed the interceptions, 5 on the season so far, though they're not going to get a ton of sacks. If they can get a defensive touchdown, that would definitely pay off, but I don't think I think getting an interception or two is probably most likely, though they are much cheaper, so that gives them some utility here. With that said, guys, thank you for liking, commenting, subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below, and have a nice day, guys.